a name that has echoed for 8 centuries. 800 years ago, in the grasslands of West Africa, a prince who could not walk as a child rose to build one of the largest empires the continent has ever seen. His name was Sundiata, and if you have never heard it, that is precisely why this book exists. Today, Sundiata is celebrated across West Africa and beyond as the founding father of the Mali Empire, the predecessor of the empire that would later make Mansa Musa famous across 3 continents. In the countries of modern Mali, Guinea, and the Gambia, his story is still sung by hereditary historians called griots, whose families have carried his memory for generations. Schools, stadiums, and streets bear his name. A Hollywood animated film drew on his legend. He is, in the words of historians who study the region, the figure at the heart of Mande cultural identity. But here is the honest thing this book must say at the outset. Sundiata Keita is also one of the most difficult figures in African history to pin down. His story is magnificent. Separating the history from the legend is harder and more interesting than the legend alone. Chapter 2. The World Before Mali. Before Sundiata, West Africa was not an empty stage waiting for a hero. For centuries, the region had been home to organized and wealthy states connected to the world's great trade routes. The most powerful of them was the Ghana Empire, not in the territory of modern Ghana, but further north in the Sahel, the dry belt of land that edges the southern Sahara. By controlling the roads along which gold moved north and salt moved south, Ghana grew formidably rich. By the 12th century, however, Ghana was unraveling. Drought, civil conflict, and the rise of rival powers steadily weakened it. Into the vacuum stepped the Sosso, a kingdom built by the Soninke people, under a ruler named Sumanguru Kanté. From the ruins of Ghana's authority, Sumanguru seized the old capital at Kumbi-Sela and extended his reach over neighboring peoples, including the Mande-speaking Malink of the Manden heartland. It was this world, a world in flux, where old powers were falling and new ones had not yet risen, into which Sundiata Keita was born, probably around 1217. The stage was dangerous, and the story about to begin was one of survival, exile, and return. Chapter 3. The Mande World, People, Power, and the Griots. The Malink, also called Mandinka or Mande people, were not one kingdom, but a cluster of chiefdoms sharing language, custom, and identity across the Manden homeland, roughly the area where modern Mali, Guinea, and Senegal meet. Their society was layered, a hereditary nobility of warrior clans at its head, specialist craftsmen, and tradespeople in the middle ranks, and beneath all of them the institution of slavery, which was woven into the economy of the whole region. At the center of Mande cultural life stood the griots, in the Mandinka language, the Jelu. These were not mere entertainers. They were the living libraries of their people, memorizing genealogies, histories, royal decisions, and moral teachings, then transmitting them through song, speech, and the music of the kora and the balafon. A great king without a griot was a king without a memory. A griot's words could raise a warrior's courage, or shame a coward in front of his entire community. This is the tradition that preserved Sundiata's story, and the reason why, 8 centuries later, we can tell it at all. It is also the reason we must weigh it carefully. An oral tradition is a living thing, shaped by each generation that carries it. Chapter 4. The Prophecy and the Birth, Legend, and What Lies Behind It. The Epic of Sundiata, as passed down by griots and written down most famously by the Guinean scholar Jibril Tamsir Niane in 1960 from the oral account of the griot Deli Mamudo Kuyati, opens with a prophecy. A hunter appears before the king of the Manden, Nare Magan Konat, and predicts that if the king marries a particular woman who will be brought to him, she will bear a son of extraordinary destiny, a son who will make the Manden name great across the world. The king marries the woman Sogalan, Kandeti. Their son is Sundiata. By tradition, the boy is born around 1217, though no contemporary written source records this date. This kind of origin story, the prophecy, the unpromising birth, the unlikely hero, appears across many cultures and many centuries. Historians treat it as meaningful symbol rather than literal record. What it tells us is what the Mande people believed about their great founder, that his greatness was inevitable, that it was written into the world before he arrived. Whether that is history or faith, it has shaped how Sundiata's story has been told and believed ever since. Chapter 5. The Lion Who Could Not Walk. The detail that distinguishes Sundiata most sharply in the oral tradition is this: as a small child, he could not walk. By tradition, he crawled while other children ran, and his mother Sogolan was mocked by the rival wives of the king's court, in particular by Sasuma Berete, mother of Dankaran Tumen, the king's eldest son by another wife, who was first in line for the throne. The epic describes a moment when Sogolan's humiliation became unbearable, and she wept. In response, Sundiata rose. He called for an iron rod, bent it with the force of his grip, and used it to push himself upright. Once standing, he walked. In other versions, he grasps the branch of a great baobab tree and tears it from the earth. The miracle is told differently by different griots. What historians note is this: the theme of a chosen child overcoming early weakness to demonstrate hidden power is ancient and cross-cultural. Whether Sundiata truly had a physical disability, or whether the epic encodes the idea that his greatness was not obvious until the moment it had to be, we cannot know. But the image has endured for 8 centuries and remains one of the most powerful in West African oral literature. Chapter 6. A Prince in Exile. When Nari Magankonut died, the succession did not go smoothly. By tradition, Dankaran Tumen took the throne, and Sasuma Berete moved to secure her son's position against any rival. Sundiata, still young, was a threat she could not ignore. The epic describes plots against his life and the deliberate destruction of his reputation at court. To protect her children, Sogolan took Sundiata and his siblings into exile, moving from court to court across the region. Guests of different kings, never staying long enough to become a burden or a danger, the names the epic gives to the kingdoms they visited, Djidjiba, Tabon, Mema, appear as real places, and some can be tentatively identified. Historians note that displaced princes, and their families moving between courts, were a common feature of the region's political landscape. Exile was not merely hardship, it was an education. The young Sundiata, by tradition, a gifted hunter, even as an adolescent, was learning the peoples, the roads and the politics of a world he would one day need to command. At the court of the king of Mema, he is said to have risen to the rank of general, the exiled prince becoming, quietly, a proven leader. The griots remember Mema fondly. It was where Sundiata became a man. Chapter 7. The Tyrant of the Sosso. While Sundiata was in exile, Sumanguru Kanté was extending his grip across the western Sudan. He had seized Kumbisela, the old capital of the collapsed Ghana Empire, and from there pushed his authority over the Malink chiefdoms of the Manden, imposing tribute, and ruling with, by all surviving accounts, a heavy hand. Those accounts must be read carefully. Every source we have about Sumanguru comes from the tradition of his conquerors. The Epic of Sundiata depicts him as a sorcerer king who wore a robe made of human skin and kept a tower of severed heads, images that serve the purpose of making Sundiata's victory feel like the triumph of good over evil. Whether the real Sumanguru was a monster or simply an effective and aggressive ruler who made dangerous enemies, we cannot say with certainty. What the broader historical record does support is the political reality. Sumanguru was the dominant power in the region in the 1220s, and early 1230s He had real military strength, and the disgruntled chiefdoms under his rule had real reason to want him removed. The grievance that would bring Sundiata's coalition together was not invented by the epic. It was the lived experience of the Malink nobles who had watched their autonomy stripped away. Chapter 8. The Call to Return. By the early 1230s, Sundiata had grown into a man, and a warrior with a reputation that preceded him. The epic holds that messengers arrived from the Manden, sent by those who still remembered Narmagan Konat's son, and who were desperate for relief from the Sosso yoke. His brother Dankaran Tuman had proved unable to resist Sumanguru and had fled into the forest country to the south. The people needed someone different. The summons put Sundiata before a choice. He could remain where he was, in Mema, where the local king had made him a general, and promised him a share of the kingdom, or he could return to the land of his birth, face Sumanguru, and try to win back what his father had held. According to tradition, he did not hesitate. He is said to have declared that a man without a homeland is nothing, and that he would go home. Historians cannot verify the exact words or circumstances of this decision. The words of oral tradition should never be treated as a verbatim historical record. What the broader evidence does support is the result. In the early 1230s, a coalition began to form against the Sosso, and a prince of the Keita line emerged to lead it. The return from exile, whatever its precise details, was real. Chapter 9. Building the alliance, Sundiata did not march on Sumanguru alone. One of the most historically credible elements of his story is the coalition, a confederation of Mande chiefdoms whose leaders were tired of Sosso domination and willing to follow a prince whose lineage and ability they respected. The epic names the allied chiefs and their chiefdoms: Fran Kamara of Taban, Kamanjan of Sibi. Fanoni Kanté and others are listed with their clans and their reasons for joining the cause. Historians cannot independently verify every name, but the principle of coalition building is well attested in the region's political culture. No single chieftain could challenge a power like Sumanguru alone, and Sundiata's achievement was precisely to make unity possible where rivalry had prevented it. He reportedly traveled between the chiefs, calling in obligations, demonstrating both his skill as a hunter-warrior and his right by birth to lead. In Mande society, where hereditary standing and personal prowess were both essential to authority, this combination was potent. A leader who was merely well-born might be ignored. One who was also demonstrably capable could not be. By the early 1230s, the coalition was ready. Warriors who had fought under different banners would now fight under one. The stage was set for a confrontation that would decide the future of the Western Sudan. Chapter 10. The campaign against Sumanguru, the campaign that followed Sundiata's return, was not a single battle, but a series of engagements over several years. As his growing alliance pushed back against Sosso authority, capturing towns and winning over more chiefs, as each victory enhanced his credibility. The oral tradition records a sequence of confrontations before the decisive encounter, with the epic attributing some early setbacks to Sumanguru's command of supernatural power, his ability to vanish, to absorb the blows of ordinary weapons. For the griots, this explained how so formidable an enemy survived, as long as he did. Historians read these passages as the language of oral epic encoding, real military, and political facts. Sumanguru was experienced, well-organized, and not easily dislodged. Sundiata's genius, in the years of campaigning before the final battle, was less any magical weapon, and more the sustained political work of keeping a fragile coalition together, motivated, and supplied, across multiple seasons of fighting. Alliances of this kind were notoriously unstable. Individual chiefs had their own interests, their own feuds, their own temptations to defect. That Sundiata held his coalition together long enough to reach the decisive engagement is itself a significant historical achievement. By around 1235, the two armies were approaching a final confrontation. Chapter 11. The Battle of Kirina, around 1235. Historians date the Battle of Kirina to around 1235, placing it in the Kulakoro region of what is now Mali. The exact location is not precisely established by archaeology, but the battle is treated by scholars as a real event, the decisive engagement that ended Sosso dominance and confirmed the political primacy of Sundiata's coalition. The Epic of Sundiata frames the battle in dramatic terms. Sundiata fires an arrow tipped with a cock's spur, the one substance that, by tradition, could pierce Sumanguru's supernatural protection. Sumanguru is wounded and flees. In some versions, he transforms into a rock or a mountain, disappearing from history entirely. Historians regard these elements as the characteristic language of oral epic, rather than military record. The meaningful truth they encode is real. Sumanguru's power was broken at Kirina, comprehensively and permanently. Sumanguru's fate after the battle is genuinely uncertain. Piyo dai diti, pi dao senti wanda. Whether he died in the field, fled into lasting exile, or died later and elsewhere is debated. What is agreed is that the Sosso kingdom collapsed rapidly in the aftermath, and that Sundiata was left as the uncontested dominant force in the Western Sudan. The battle that the griots had been singing about for 8 centuries was real. Its consequences were real. Its details, as always, are where legend and history become hardest to separate. Chapter 12. After the victory, building a new order. Victory at Kirina did not automatically produce an empire. It produced an opportunity, and the work of turning that opportunity into enduring power required political skill as much as military force. This, historians suggest, is where Sundiata's real greatness was displayed. According to tradition, preserved in the oral record, and recognized by UNESCO in 2009 as intangible cultural heritage, the chiefs who had fought together assembled at a place called Kurukan Fuga shortly after the victory. There, they proclaimed the Kurukan Fuga, also known as the Manden Charter, a declaration that established the federation of Mande clans under a single authority, set out the rules of governance, and, in terms remarkable for the 13th century, articulated principles of individual rights. The charter, as reconstructed by scholars from the oral tradition, addressed social organization, property, environmental protection, and personal responsibility. One passage called for humane treatment of enslaved people, not abolition, but a recognition of limits. Another established freedom of expression and trade. Historians note that the charter was not written down in Sundiata's time. It lived in the griot's memory, which makes its precise content difficult to pin down. Its broad existence and significance, however, are not in doubt. Chapter 13. The Manden Charter, a founding document. The Kurukan Fuga, assembled at Kurukan Fuga, by tradition shortly after Kirina, organized its principles across 4 areas: social organization, property rights, environmental protection, and personal responsibilities. Scholars who have studied the reconstructed text note that it predates the Magna Carta by only about 20 years, and in some respects addresses a broader range of rights and duties. Among its 44 provisions, the inviolability of the human person, freedom of expression, and trade, rules on the management of land and its resources, and the structure of the empire's governance. 16 warrior clans led and defended the state. 4 clans guided matters of Islamic law. Specialist craft clans held protected roles, and 4 clans of Jalu griots were made responsible for maintaining the historical record of the empire. That last provision is striking. The charter did not merely create a government. It also created its own memory by formally designating the people who would remember it. It is partly thanks to that provision that we have the story at all. The empire Sundiata founded lasted, in various forms, for more than 4 centuries, a tribute to the political architecture of its founder as much as to its military victories. Chapter 14. Gold, Salt, and the Empire's Engine. What gave the Mali Empire its staying power was not military victory alone, but the economic foundations Sundiata secured through his conquests. The most important of these was control over the trade routes that moved gold northward and salt southward across the western Sudan. Gold came from the rich gold fields of Bambuk and Bur, in the well-watered lands to the southwest of the Manden heartland. This gold traveled north across the Sahara to feed the economies of North Africa, Egypt, and, ultimately, medieval Europe. Mali did not necessarily own every mine, but it taxed every load that moved through its territory, and protected the roads that made safe trade possible. Salt was equally essential. In the heat of West Africa, salt was a dietary necessity and a vital food preserve, yet the South had almost none. The great desert mines of Tagaza, deep in the Sahara, produced salt in enormous rectangular slabs, which caravans carried southward to exchange for gold and other goods. The price differential between North and South was so extreme that in some southern markets, salt traded weight for weight against gold itself. Sundiata's empire sat at the meeting point of these two great flows. To hold that position, and to keep the peace that let commerce move safely, was to hold the region's wealth. Chapter 15. Niani, the capital city. Sundiata established his capital at Niani, on the plain of the Sankarani River, a tributary of the Upper Niger. The choice was strategic. The Sankarani gave year-round navigable water access, and the plains around it were fertile enough to feed a large and growing population. For the next 3 centuries, Niani served as the political, commercial, and cultural heart of the Mali Empire. Arab and North African visitors described a large and well-ordered city, markets, a royal compound, mosques, the residences of merchants and officials. The Moroccan traveler Ibn Battuta, who visited Mali in 1352, nearly a century after Sundiata's death, described a capital of considerable size and orderly justice, where strangers were treated respectfully, and thieves were unknown. However, the archaeology of Niani is more complicated. Extensive excavations have found evidence of significant trade and manufacturing activity in the area, particularly from the 15th century. But clear physical evidence of the royal capital, described by 14th century Arabic sources, has proved difficult to establish. Some 21st century historians have questioned whether the location of the capital shifted over time. The ground beneath modern Guinea holds answers that archaeologists have not yet fully retrieved, a reminder that the history of West Africa is still actively being written, not settled. Chapter 16. Faith, Tradition, and a Complex Empire. One complexity the epic does not fully address, but scholars do, is that Sundiata's religious world was layered. Islam had reached the Mande trading classes along the trans-Saharan routes by the 12th century, adopted by merchants and some rulers, while older spiritual practices remained vigorous among the warrior nobility and the wider population. Sacred power objects, called boli, hunters' initiations, and the authority of the ancestors were at the heart of Mande warrior identity. Sundiata himself is sometimes described in the epic as Muslim, but the evidence is not straightforward. The griots who preserved his story were themselves Muslim by the time their accounts were recorded in the 20th century, and some scholars argue that the Islamic coloring of the epic tells us as much about later centuries as about the 1230s. What does seem certain is that Sundiata ruled a religiously mixed empire with skill. Muslim merchants and scholars were indispensable to the trade networks he depended on. The loyalty of the traditional warrior clans depended on respecting their older ways. This careful balance between the world of Islam and the world of Mande tradition was not a contradiction, but a foundation. It would define the character of the Mali Empire for generations, and it began with Sundiata's own practical wisdom. As a ruler, Chapter 17, the empire expands. In the years following Kirina, Sundiata and his generals pressed outward from the Manden heartland. By the time his reign reached its mature phase, the Mali Empire had absorbed or asserted dominance over a vast territory, encompassing the old Ghana heartland, the goldfields of Bambuk and Bur, the desert edge trading towns, and the routes toward the great bend of the river Niger. The capture of Kumbi Sale, the former capital of the Ghana Empire, is dated by some sources to around 1240, an event of symbolic weight as much as strategic importance, announcing that Mali had eclipsed what had come before. Control of Walata, a key node of trans-Saharan commerce, brought the empire's taxation net over the most profitable section of the northern trade. Sundiata did not govern this territory through force alone. The Kurukan Fuga structure gave allied chiefs a genuine stake in the empire's success. Governors were placed in key towns, trade was protected, roads were maintained and made safe enough that merchants could move without excessive fear. These are the conditions that, nearly a century later, would allow Ibn Battuta to remark on the remarkable security of travel within Mali's borders. Sundiata built the machine. His successors, including the great Mansa Musa, ran it to its fullest extent. Chapter 18. The Lion King and the Lion of Mali. The name Sundiata has meant different things to different people across the centuries. In the Mande world he is above all the Simban, the master hunter, and the son of Narmagan Konat, who fulfilled a destiny carved into the world before he was born. In the wider world, his story became more famous in a different form. When Disney released The Lion King in 1994, several scholars noted the structural resemblances between the film's story and the epic of Sundiata, the rightful heir exiled, the usurping villain, the return, and restoration. Disney did not credit the source, and the parallels may be partly coincidental. The monomyth is ancient and cross-cultural, but the observation gave many people their first sense that a West African epic had been shaping global storytelling in ways they had not known. The Keita lineage endured long after Sundiata. His son Mansa Uli inherited a functioning empire and made his own pilgrimage to Mecca, an early signal of the dynasty's direction. His descendant Mansa Musa, reigning nearly 80 years after Sundiata's death, would take that empire to its greatest territorial extent and carry its name across 3 continents. Without the coalition forged at Kirina, the charter assembled at Kurukan Fuga, and the trade route secured in the 1230s and 1240s, none of what came after was possible. Chapter 19. Death in the Undisclosed Grave. Sundiata Keita died around 1255, roughly 20 years after the Battle of Kirina. Even the manner of his death is uncertain. Some oral traditions say he was struck accidentally by a stray arrow during a public celebration and died of the wound. Others say he drowned in the Sankarani River. A few versions suggest he simply disappeared, as great figures sometimes do in legend when the reality of dying proves too ordinary for the story. What is certain is that no grave has ever been identified. This is deliberate. In Mande royal tradition, the burial place of a king was kept secret to prevent enemies or rivals from disturbing the remains. Sundiata's tomb is unknown, and perhaps unknowable, a gap in the record that has made the legend easier to sustain across the centuries. The empire he left was stable enough to pass to his son Mansa Uli, who ruled with confidence and continued the family's tradition of Islamic practice. The Keita dynasty ruled Mali, in one form or another, for the better part of 2 centuries after Sundiata's death, a record of longevity that few founders of any empire in any age can match. The man may be gone from the historical record, the world he built remained, and shaped West Africa, and through West Africa the wider world, long after. Chapter 20. What we really know, and why it matters. So what do we actually know? The honest answer is, less than the legend, and more than enough to matter. Sundiata Keita almost certainly existed. The foundation of the Mali Empire in the mid-13th century, the defeat of the Sosso kingdom, the establishment of trade route control across the western Sudan, and the creation of a political system capable of lasting 4 centuries are all real historical events, even if their exact chronology and detail remain uncertain. The Arabic sources that give us reliable written evidence begin to mention Mali from the 13th century onward, but do not mention Sundiata by name in the earliest surviving texts. Ibn Khaldun, writing in the late 14th century, is among the first to discuss the founding in detail. The Epic of Sundiata is not history in the modern sense, but it is evidence. It encodes what the Mande people believed had made them great: courage overcoming weakness, unity overcoming division, justice outlasting conquest. The fact that the epic has been sung for 800 years, recognized by UNESCO as World Cultural Heritage, and continues to inspire generations across West Africa, tells us something true about Sundiata Keita. Even where the written record falls short, his story matters not because every detail can be verified, but because it shaped a civilization. A note on history and sources. Sundiata Keita almost certainly existed and founded the Mali Empire. But the primary source for his life is not a medieval document. It is the Epic of Sundiata, an oral poem kept alive for 8 centuries by griots, and first written down in 1960 by the Guinean historian Jibril Tamsir from the account of the griot Jeli Mamudo Kuyati. The epic is invaluable. It is one of the great works of world literature, but it is a literary and cultural monument, not a chronicle. Its timelines, dramatic episodes, and miraculous elements are the language of oral epic, not the language of modern historiography. Contemporary or near-contemporary Arabic sources. The genre that gives us the most reliable written evidence for West African rulers of this period. Do not mention Sundiata by name in the earliest surviving texts. The historian Ibn Khaldun, writing in the late 14th century, is among the first Arabic sources to discuss the Mali Empire's founding in detail, roughly 150 years after the events. Ibn Battuta's 1352 visit to Mali gives us rich detail about the empire in his day, not Sundiata's. This does not disprove Sundiata's existence. It means we should hold the specific details of his biography with appropriate care. Where this book states something as established historical fact, it reflects the scholarly consensus in the sources listed below. Where it uses phrases such as by tradition, the epic holds, historians debate, or we cannot verify, it means exactly that. No words have been invented or attributed to real people. The illustrations in this book are artistic interpretations created with the assistance of artificial intelligence image generation software. They are not photographs, historical portraits, or contemporary depictions of any person living or dead. Mande dress architecture and settings have been researched for period accuracy, but some artistic license is unavoidable in any illustrated history. About Griot. Griot tells the true stories of African and Black history with the care they deserve, researched, sourced, and beautifully illustrated. We separate legend from history, and we say clearly which is which. If you enjoyed this book, look out for more titles in the series. Copyright 2026, published independently via Griot.